Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to participate in this panel, Anna in particular. It's a great privilege, and I hope I can make just a few comments before the discussion is widened. I should perhaps add that the views that I may express and the comments that I make are entirely my own. No one with whom I work wants to be associated with anything I say. And so if they're different to the views that you hear from other P&I club managers, I apologize. I also know that time is rather limited. So what I think I should do is just make one or two observations which reflect upon how the P&I clubs have been impacted. I think we start with the pandemic, I suppose. And here's a sort of curious scenario. You wake up one morning and without trial, you were told that you will have to remain in your house for 23 out of 24 hours for an indefinite period of time. You're told that there will be limits on food. You can't see people. There is no jury. There is no prosecution. There is no trial. There is just Boris Johnson telling you what you have to do or not have to do. You would say that that wasn't really a sort of typical reflection of the way that society was organized now, and yet it is. So the first thing that the pandemic did, and I'm not just talking about shipping, was to create an extraordinary circumstance in which democracy, fair trial, all of the things that we value were thrown out of the window, effectively a kind of imprisonment. That was the government response. And of course there were, and there are, peripheral consequences, human contact, loss of the opportunity to be spontaneous, all the normal things that one does in an ordinary world when you go to work. I don't know now, I can't remember, but I think it must have been 6 or 9 months at its height when most people were effectively trapped in their own, in their houses or flats. Quite a thing, and that impact, if you like, starts the whole process off. And yet, from our point of view, and I agree with the previous speaker, Ilias, we didn't see a tsunami of claims. And it was remarkable, I think, how resilient our members were. I mean, without saying anything that wasn't in the papers and isn't in the papers. Just think about the financial resilience of the cruise ship industry. The refunding or the funding, if you like, to sort of keep these businesses going or not going in layup was billions and billions of dollars. And even now, when you look back over sort of 3 or 3.5 years, you wouldn't say that the shipping industry as a whole had lost a large number or an unprecedented number of operators. You would say, however, I think, that the shipping industry had borne these losses largely itself without needing to or without being able to have recourse to insurers. So the first comment I would make, or the first observation, is that although the P&I clubs, certainly if, like ours, were very involved inevitably in all matters to do with the pandemic, although that was a daily issue for us for months and months and months, nevertheless it didn't result in any significant loss in business. Most of the clubs sort of emerged or have emerged from this experience with roughly the same tonnage that they went into it. Most of the operators continue to trade and are now, thankfully in many cases, trading effectively. And there were some who, throughout the pandemic, managed to operate very well, I think it's fair to say. Of course, the important point is that by the spring or the summer of 2000, an awful lot of operators had simply put their fleets on ice and were not interested in carrying on unless the world changed. We saw an awful lot of crew abandonment. We saw an awful lot of quarantine cases. We saw all the things you might expect as a result of this kind of event. And I'd say I don't want to appear to be sort of indifferent to it, but it didn't really have the impact that we thought it would have. But of course, the introduction of sanctions and regulations and prohibited cargoes changed an awful lot. And I agree with Ilias, there was a lot of administration involved. There still is a lot of administration. There's more administration now than there has been in the past, not just because of the price cap, but because of attestation, of course. And because, most importantly, when an underwriter takes on or considers taking on a risk, a new risk in particular, it's up to him to decide whether or not he has the appetite for it. And even though some of the dark fleet may be operating legally, nevertheless, that doesn't mean that the underwriters who are invited to cover it will wish to do so. And in fact, I mean, for a club like ours, which is pretty conservative and conscious always of the need, first and foremost, to serve its members and to do so faithfully. You know, for a club like ours, most of the time we were looking at risks that we didn't want to take on. Not because we said that this risk involved a direct breach of sanctions or was unlawful or any of those things. Not for that reason at all. Rather, because we didn't want to impose upon our existing members an untoward risk, a risk that they wouldn't necessarily have expected us to impose if they were given a choice. So although we talk about the law and the regulations and the price cap and all the various sort of technical things, what we're really talking about at this point is how do we treat our existing members and how do we treat prospective members who apply for membership. The answer to the first is, when it comes to our existing members, is that it's not our job to go around advising them to breach their contracts. It's our job to sustain their businesses as best we can on a mutual basis, so that all members in the club are fairly treated and derive benefit from it. And that, I suppose, inevitably leads to the conclusion that most of the time we will look at risks that have some Russian connection, perhaps, and decide that it would not be appropriate for us to take it on. And the dark fleet is a difficulty. I'm not even sure what the dark fleet is. I don't know whether it, by definition, or someone's definition, it means a fleet that is effectively in breach of a sanction or in breach of some other obligation that it will not comply with, or whether it means a fleet that's operated sort of close to the bone, possibly doing things that might very easily be illegal, possibly not. We have to make all of those judgments. And Elias is right again. The result of that has been quite a lot of administrative burden for us, quite a lot of research, because if you don't demonstrate that you've exercised really coherent due diligence in order to weed out potential problems, then you will not get away with it with the regulators, whether they be the US regulators or the European regulators. We have to assume that we have to err on the side of caution, and we have to assume that the regulatory bodies are keeping a very close eye on people like us, who are insurers, to make sure that we don't inadvertently, and certainly don't deliberately, support operators who are intentionally breaching the regulations. And that sort of takes me to another sort of strange thing. Of course, services, legal services, banking services, all of these sort of services are absolutely critical. And we may easily see, we often do see, fleets that are very well operated, perhaps running a little bit close to the risk, but they're well operated. And yet we decide we can't provide cover because we're not confident that we'll be allowed to discharge our obligations in the future. It's all very well to take on a fleet, to take it on in the knowledge that claims will arise, to take it on in the expectation that those claims will be covered. But if we also fear that the service channels, law, finance, if we fear that they won't perform, what do? We have to back off. Because what we can't do is take on business which depends upon services of various kinds when we think that those services may be withdrawn. For example, some time ago, quite a lot of American banks effectively said, although it's legal for us to fund and sustain some of these operators, we're not going to do so because it'll make us very unpopular and it will jeopardize our own position in the future. So even though everything is fine, we may think that the risk associated with a new prospect is too great because no one will service it, no one will make the claims payments, no one will pay the fees, no one will do all the other things that are necessary in order to fully accomplish the objectives of mutual entry. I think I'm sure that many people here will feel the same thing. But I also think it's worth bearing in mind what these regulations say. We're on the 10th package now, I think, in Europe, and what they mean. So that sounds like a simple question. What do they mean? Well, it isn't a very simple question. And I think we've probably had more discussions at Steamship Mutual about this than anything else. What does the fine print really mean? How far do you really have to go in terms of checking out a particular member? How extensive does your due diligence have to be? How much history do you have to look into? Is going back a year enough? Is going back 20 years far too much? What about the history of the owners of the fleet? All of these things, and they all create uncertainty. Now, if you're a reasonably conservative ship owner with a concern about sustainability and going into the future, what do you do when you're confronted with a list of obligations, complicated, long, changing, a list of obligations that you're supposed to comply with? If you don't really understand them and you don't really know exactly how far they allow you to go or not, you pull back. So you have this extraordinary situation. Well, it's not extraordinary, it's very common. You have a core, and at that core is the primary regulation or prohibition or whatever, or sanction or whatever it may be, and it's reasonably clear. And then around the core, moving out from the center, you have the penumbra. The penumbra is an area where there may or may not be a straightforward answer to the question of cover, but you don't know. There's no court case that tells you. And the nature of the penumbra is that it may or it may not apply. So you have conservative, well-managed ship owners effectively drawing back from the possibility of taking on perfectly legal business because they're concerned about how the regulations might be interpreted. So interpretation of the regulations, which have been enacted by government bodies on a frequent basis and in great detail, that's quite a burden for a P&I club to have to bear. I mean, to what extent are we supposed to take on the risk that, quite innocently, we will misunderstand or not entirely see the extent and scope of these regulations? I think probably most of the other comments I was going to make will sort of emerge in the course of today. In the United Kingdom, of course, we have our own way of handling claims and national upsets. We throw an incredibly large and expensive party, invite the royal family to it, and hope that their presence will dispense with weather problems and war problems. It hasn't worked at all so far, but it is a possibility. I also remember just how things have changed. 3.5 or 4 years ago, we were talking within the international group about drones. Drones at the moment are not uninsured, they're just part of the normal background, if you like. The P&I clubs don't exclude liability arising from the use of drones. But 3.5 years ago, all we were really thinking about when it came to drones was privacy. Whether or not drones were a threat to privacy and whether or not that didn't matter, because what mattered more was their usefulness when it comes to sort of navigating ships in close quarters and things of that kind and inspecting damage. Just think how it's changed. Now drones are weapons or means of surveillance and weapons of war. And we have to understand, I think, that the war risk component is unlikely to suddenly sort of become easier and more moderate. We only have to look at the newspaper every week and we can see that things are sort of ratcheting up as we go along. I think, I don't know, I think perhaps enough is enough at the moment. I could ramble on incessantly. I mean, if you've got 3 hours, we could have a really long discussion. But I think probably I've covered the essentials. I will just say, though, that I think from a P&I club perspective, if you want the sort of single sentence, it is that the challenges imposed by war and sanctions and the challenges that were imposed by the pandemic haven't really materialized in the way we feared. This is not to say that terrible hardship hasn't been suffered, or that people have been hugely impacted, or that the working conditions for the people with whom we work have not been dreadful, I think, in some ways, isolated, lonely, and without sort of succor or help. It's just that it hasn't happened to the extent that I think most of us may have feared. When I think about the way I felt in the spring or summer of 2000, it wasn't very optimistic. And I wasn't quite sure, and I'm sure none of us was quite sure, about how and when and in what circumstances the pandemic would ease. And I have to say, I think we should recognize the pandemic is not over. It's not behind us. It's simply not existential at the moment. It doesn't threaten our existence. But it certainly exists, and you'll probably have read about the number of cruise vessels in Australia which were inspected and detained because pretty much everybody on board each of them tested positive for the virus. It's just that with vaccination and various other means, that didn't materialize into hospitalization. But who are we to know? So the watchword from our point of view is exercise caution. Your members will appreciate it if you exercise caution. They will not appreciate it if they discover that the managers of the club are taking unwarranted risks. And if in doubt, consult lawyers and experts, which we do with frequency. Sorry to have overshot my time. Thank you very much indeed.